one of the key things is what's known as metacognitive awareness, where you're able to step back from the thoughts and observe the thoughts from a witnessing awareness. So then you're not as involved in the content of the thought or trying to change the content. It's more just you're aware of it, and then is it useful or not? So yeah, all of the third wave approaches, then it has that component of mindfulness that involves stepping back. Being aware of a thought versus thinking a thought is the distinction. And then also there can be different mindfulness practices that are also about getting in touch with the body and just working on being in the present moment.
Hi, I'm Ricky Dores. Welcome to episode 32 of the Mind That Ego podcast. Reverend Doctor John Freese returns to the show to share his synthesis of Buddhism and acceptance and commitment therapy. John is a Buddhist minister and spent 12 years as a monk with Thich Nhat Hanh. He has a PhD in practical theology and a Master of Divinity. In addition to his Buddhist counselling practice, he teaches contemplative studies at University of the West and Naropa University. As John guides me through his model, we stop along the way to discuss practical matters from discerning genuine values, taking meaningful action, handling difficult emotions, being aware of thought, and how to cultivate wholesome states of mind. This is a comprehensive and useful overview of a pragmatic system that will benefit those just beginning and those in advanced stages of their spiritual journey. So John, welcome back to the Mind That Ego podcast.
Thanks a lot, Ricky. Good to be back.
It's great to see you again. I know last time we touched upon the trauma-informed approach to Vipassana and meditation. And in this episode, we're going to look at your approach that fuses Buddhism and acceptance and commitment therapy, which we're really excited to explore. We will, it's actually a first for the podcast. We're going to add graphics. So that's exciting. We're going to have some graphics on this one. I'm wondering, like, to start us off, if we could begin by looking at how you kind of saw these two approaches as compatible and what initially drew you to putting these together and making this comparison or synthesis before then leading into the technical overview of the different systems and how they kind of work together.
Yeah, sure. So just as a refresher, in case people hadn't heard the first episode we did together, so I was a Buddhist monk for 12 years. And then after that, I moved back to the States and went to graduate school. And so I did a Master of Divinity at University of the West, which is a Buddhist college in LA. And then I did my PhD at Claremont School of Theology, focusing on practical theology. And so that's in Claremont, which is in LA County. So it's near LA. And so actually there was a deal between University of the West and Claremont School of Theology where you could take classes in either of the places. So I was at a Christian theology school, but I could take classes at the Buddhist University where I did my master's. So my PhD was focused on pastoral counseling. And so I took a psychology class at University of the West. And so it was taught by the chair of the department, Hiro Sasaki. And so the class was on third wave behavioral therapy was the title of the class. And so he taught acceptance commitment therapy, dialectical behavioral therapy, mindfulness-based stress reduction, and mindfulness-based cognitive therapy. So those are all considered third wave models. And so when I was learning about ACT, it definitely like made a lot of sense and it really clicked for me. And as part of my PhD, I had to do a clinical residency at a counseling center. And so I was looking for a model that I could use in the counseling that would work as a way for me to offer the Buddhist teaching that I had. So I wanted to use my Buddhist teaching in counseling And ACT kind of gave me like a matrix or a way of organizing the Buddhist teaching so that it just made it all kind of fit together and be coherent. And then because the Buddhist teaching originally is like, a meditation retreat, or you go to the temple or something like that. So it wasn't designed to do in a counseling context, whereas ACT was designed to do in a counseling context. So basically, ACT gave me a matrix to do the counseling work using my Buddhist teaching, my Buddhist theory and practice in the context of counseling.
And I know Stephen Hayes, you've been in contact with, he's also been on the podcast before. I think he had some influence from Buddhism, right? With creating that, at least and I know you'll go over this, but the approach of infusing or integrating mindfulness or awareness, which seems to be a hallmark of that third wave. Could you, I guess for people that aren't familiar, how would you describe like behavioral therapy and the ethos of that and its purpose as a counseling tool or practice or modality?
Right. Yeah, so the idea of third wave implies there were two previous waves, right? So so the first wave is, as best as I understand it, the first wave is behavioral therapy, where it's just looking at conditioning and behavior. So B.F. Skinner would be the kind of archetypal example. And then what comes to my mind is like the idea of like Pavlov and Pavlov's dog, where he feeds the dog some food and he rings a bell when he feeds them. So they get conditioned to, when they hear the bell, they think they're going to get fed. So that would be like, you're using conditioning to work with behavior. So the idea is just you're looking at somebody's behavior patterns, and then you're trying to adapt the behavior patterns to cause some kind of positive change. So then the second wave is the cognitive behavioral therapy. And so then that looks at the relationship between cognitive story and behavior. And a lot of the work with cognitive behavioral therapy is that you're looking at the thought patterns and then assessing them for, how accurate are they? If you have a negative thought pattern, is there a way then to replace it with a positive thought pattern? You're working with the cognitive content and as it relates to behavior. So then the third wave, like you're saying, the hallmark tends to be that it brings in mindfulness practice. And so that's kind of a game changer, because one of the qualities of mindfulness practice is the ability to step back from your thoughts and just observe your thoughts. So it's sorry, my dog is...
He's jumping on the computer.
Well, anyway,
he wants to guest on the show.
If you see my computer moving around, it's because I'm adjusting for my dog. Okay, so the mindfulness, one of the key things is what's known as metacognitive awareness, where you're able to step back from the thoughts and observe the thoughts from a witnessing awareness. So then you're not as involved in the content of the thought or trying to change the content. It's more just you're aware of it, and then is it useful or not? So yeah, all of the third wave approaches, then it has that component of mindfulness that involves stepping back. Being aware of a thought versus thinking a thought is the distinction. And then also there can be different mindfulness practices that are also about getting in touch with the body and just working on being in the present moment. So I think that's kind of the general distinction between the three different waves.
Yeah, I know ACT, I think, is one of or the most kind of studied and like the research behind it is really solid as well, isn't it, in terms of the effect of it and its usefulness in that therapeutic setting, and for self-help as well. And I know that's something we'll look at today. We touched upon one of the components of ACT with mindfulness. I wonder if you could give an overview of the six processes that are core to the ACT approach?
Sure. So yeah, Stephen Hayes, one of the main developers, he was influenced somewhat by mindfulness. So actually, I was able to talk to him after we did our first episode, so he kind of told me more. So he was influenced also by Yogananda and the Self-Realization Fellowship. And so I think one of the main things he got was just this ability to get in touch with the witnessing awareness. And then that led him to go deeper into his own research in behavioral psychology. So I think he was influenced somewhat by mindfulness and Eastern traditions, and that was kind of like a catalyst for him to go deeper into the behavioral psychology. And so basically what he came up with is this idea of, happiness or wellness. He would define it as psychological flexibility. And then unhappiness or, suffering, so to speak, he characterized that as psychological rigidity. And so then he isolated 6 different processes. So each process has a positive side and a negative side, like a flip side. And so these 6 processes he found, these are the core processes that can lead to greater psychological flexibility and or greater psychological rigidity. And so they don't necessarily go in any particular order. They're interconnected with each other. So I'll just kind of list them off. The flexibility side, and then the flip side is the rigidity side. Okay, so one is contact with the present moment. So if you're a therapist working with a client, you're assessing, is the person able to be in the present moment, or are they tending to be caught up in regrets about the past or worries about the future? So that would be contact with the present moment. So the flip side would be not in contact with the present moment. Right. Okay.
Bit disconnected, bit kind of dissociated from the
right.
Yeah.
Right. Then you have the process of acceptance, which means, can you accept what's arising in your awareness versus experiential avoidance? You're trying to push it away or get away from it. And a lot of time that has to do with physical sensations and emotions. Are you able to be with those things? Can you hold them in your awareness versus you push it away or try to escape from it? Okay, then another one is cognitive diffusion. So diffusion is technically not a word yet in the dictionary, but it is a good word, I think.
Yeah, agreed.
So that's what we were saying, the difference between being aware of a thought versus thinking a thought. So meaning that there's some cognitive narrative happening. And so it's the difference between buying into it versus you're aware of it from a more detached place. And so you're not bought into it. You can be aware of it without being bought into it. So yeah, just various thought patterns that you would have, you're tuning into, am I grabbing on or am I just aware that it's there? Yeah. Okay. Then there's another one called self as context. And so this is similar to the cognitive diffusion. The idea is, are you identifying or grabbing onto a concept of self versus are you able to have a more witnessing awareness of what's arising in your experience without identifying as, oh, this is me or I'm this. So in practice, it usually means, you notice, oh, I'm identifying with this concept about myself. You recognize that and you step back from it. And so you're shifting from the conceptualized self to the witnessing self. That's just the observing self. And then at an even deeper level, you can get to this non-dual ground of being, non-dual ground of awareness, in which the subject of awareness and the object of awareness are let go of or step back from.
Mm-hmm.
So there's kind of a progression then from conceptual self to witnessing self to this non-dual ground.
I'm really intrigued by that, but maybe we'll revisit
Yeah.
it because I know it can get complex. But yeah, personally, I'm really intrigued by
Yeah.
that. Yeah.
Yeah. I think this is in some ways the secret sauce inside of ACT.
Mm-hmm.
It's this, it takes mindfulness to another level, I would
Yeah.
say. So that's where it gets more spiritual, so to speak. Yeah. So it's kind of a unique quality of it, about it.
Because that as well, like what you're talking about in terms of the being aware of thoughts, diffusing from them, stepping back, as well as the concept of self in a lot of, I guess, rhetoric or the way that people describe it commonly, that would fall in the realm of what people usually refer to as ego, even though that term is used in a way that's a little diluted. But yeah, that I guess that would encompass when people say you're acting from ego or like try and not react from a place of ego. That's kind of what that captures, right? The thinking and the concept of self that can interfere with how you're relating with the world and people and I guess even your own thoughts in those kind of circumstances.
Yeah, and it's like you could have a concept like, oh, I'm a good person, I'm a bad person,
Mm-hmm.
I'm I'm John Freese, I was born on such and such a day, blah blah blah. So that's like saying I am something, right? There's a particular thing
Mm-hmm.
that you're, right? But then if you step back from that, there's just I, like, oh, I am as a separate self. So that's kind of at the root of whatever concept that's outside of you, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so yeah, then even that kind of root sense of a self, you can go deeper than that.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I think that's kind of like the territory, these kind of gradations, I guess you would say.
That's the Jedi level, isn't it?
Yeah. Right.
Like you
Yeah,
work up
exactly.
to Jedi level mastery with the
Yeah, yeah,
non-dual.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Okay, so then there's two more. One is values. Um, so in ACT, they'll say there's not a preset list of values. It's the therapist and the client work together to get in touch with and clarify what are the values that the client has. There are some general values that seem to keep coming up for that seem to be most people have them. So it's kind of like different life areas that are important to you, right? So it could
Mm-hmm.
be like family, education, job, relationship, health and wellness, recreation, spirituality, service work. So these would be like different life areas where you clarify, oh, these are areas that are important for me. Um, and so they're kind of like overall principles or overall kind of life directions that you want to focus on.
Mm-hmm.
And then related to that is the sixth process, which is committed action. So committed action would be that you're taking action on behalf of your values. So you could say, okay, well, I have a value of education. And so then a committed action could be, oh, I want to go to college and I want to get this such and such a degree, right? So that would
Mm-hmm.
be the action you take on behalf of the value. So the flip side would be that you're not in touch with your values. You don't have a clear values. Um, or sometimes you don't have a good balance between your different values. It can be kind of unbalanced.
Mm-hmm.
And then with the committed action, then it would be it's hard for you to take action on behalf of the values. Um, or yeah, you're getting caught up in actions that are going against your values. So that would be like the flip side of the committed action.
Mm-hmm. How, because I think this is like the notion of values is like something that people probably connect to a lot. And the
Mm-hmm.
reality of it can be harder to discern. Like how would someone, so there are two related things to this. Like one is, how does someone discern an authentic value compared to, you mentioned conditioning with like Pavlov's dog, like conditioning that we've had socially or through our families or through our, our friends, values that we've kind of, we think that we have compared to a true value. Like, how would you discern that?
I think one thing to think about is like, traditionally, whatever society you're in, like a lot of times the religion of the society would provide you with a set of values. And so people may have values that they've just inherited from their society. And they may or may not be a good fit for the person. And so I think that's one of the ideas of ACT is like, okay, we want to not just assume a certain set of values and then that you just have to accept it, right? So this idea that you are trying to organically find out, what really rings true for me versus what doesn't ring true. But having said that, the list I just gave of family, education, work, those tend to be fairly universal and not doesn't come across as some kind of dogmatic imposition of something. It's more, oh yeah, most people have these things. But yeah, I would say when you're actually working with somebody, I think it's a question of what feels really alive for the person, what feels like just naturally something that's resonating with them, that it's like they feel it deeply in their body. When they talk about it, they have a fair amount of energy around it. They'll keep coming back to it. So I think that's one part of it. And then another part is the tricky part of, is that something authentic coming from your core, or is that an internalized habit that you have that you may not agree with, but it's been internalized, and so it's operating. It's influencing you. And it's hard to become aware of like, oh, do I agree with this or not? Where did this come from? So I think that's the challenge is, what resonates? And then if something does resonate, is it resonating in a good way, or is it more like something that you've become convinced that you have to pay attention to this, even though it may not be what you really want to do?
I guess as well, that's like part of the examination process, because if you don't do this work and it remains unexamined, that's when it will be an unconscious acting on values that haven't been examined, whereas the examination will hopefully reveal the truth, what stays, if you kind of dig through it a little bit. And the other question I had around values was, what if you have seemingly conflicting values, or the idea of acting in accordance to them? If you're in a situation where you have two similar weighted values that actually require a different action, so you're almost then making a decision between, well, I value education. Like education might mean I've got to move to a different city and leave my relationships behind. But if I prioritize my relationships, I might not have that opportunity in terms of education. Is there a process there as well in terms of discerning when to choose some value over another, so in some way?
Yeah, so I think the processes interrelate with each other. So yeah, if you have like two kind of competing values, then you could work with it in terms of acceptance and cognitive diffusion, right? So you could be, okay, I have a value around education. And so then the therapist could say, okay, well, just kind of think about it for a little bit, the value of education. Okay, and then the therapist can ask, okay, now where do you feel that in your body? Get in touch with it as sensation in your body. And then also, what are the thought patterns? Are the thought patterns that you're just grabbing onto, or is it like, oh, it's a thought pattern that you're able to be aware of? And, do you agree or disagree with it? what's it doing for you? How is it working for you or not? So through acceptance and cognitive diffusion, you can kind of get in touch with it in such a way that you're letting go of any kind of reactions around it, and you're just trying to get in touch with it as it is. So I think sometimes just kind of becoming more clearly understanding the value is one way of just being clear, what is it? And then, because if you have two values, you could do a kind of similar process for both of those things. And then it gets into weighing which one has more weight than the other.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's, I think, a process of just kind of having to sit with it or be with it over a certain period of time. So kind of trusting in the organic process. Okay, if I'm just being with it in a clear way, letting it just kind of cook, or letting it like a chicken sitting on an egg. Over time, what seems to feel like it's the more important one or has the more weight to it? And or, is there some way to, okay, I'm going to spend the majority of my time on the value that is more important, but I'll still have a little bit of time to do the other one. Or it could be, okay, it feels like this is the one I want to do. Let me start the process and see what it's like. As I start the process, does it still seem like that, or does it change or not? So I think it's just a combination of getting in touch with it and allowing the Buddhist terminology I say is like your stored consciousness, or allow your unconscious or your stored conscious to percolate it, and let it kind of cook or get clear. So that can happen through just meditation, and then also, just kind of talking with somebody, talking about it. And so usually over time, it just kind of becomes clear. But yeah, it could be what becomes clear is, oh, this is a tough decision and it's kind of messy and it's a hard one,
Yeah, what I really like about this as well, like it's revealing the, like you mentioned, the interrelation and the kind of complex system of psychology, the way that sometimes it is a case of allowing, through that psychological flexibility, allowing something else to emerge, another solution. And I guess to use that flip side, the rigidity would be like black or white thinking, okay, well, I'm choosing this thing, committing to it, going all out, and then not necessarily adapting to change. And maybe also noticing, you mentioned the thoughts, like certain thoughts or feelings of fear or anxiety that can lead to impatience and like rushing into a decision. And I like that, how it kind of captures that interrelation as well. Were you going to add?
Yeah, well, just if you're working with something, a lot of times it's like, okay, well, if I get down to the level of sensation and emotion, what's going on at that level? And is there something I'm avoiding, or is there something I'm trying to grab onto? And then, so a lot of times that's the work, is being with that and kind of processing that. So that's like, and when you deal with that kind of underneath level stuff, it tends to help things resolve or like become more clear.
Yeah, because it also, what I like about this, it points to the tendency that we have, and I say we, just I guess in the West, and maybe men more than women at times, but to try and just problem solve and fix immediately. So it kind of counters that with the, okay, well, sometimes the actual solution just isn't ready yet. It's not emerged. So the patience, the awareness is the practice in that moment, rather than, I guess, maybe first, second wave approaches would be more like, well, just look at your thoughts and just try and understand what distortions are there, lacking that that different approach of awareness and trust, I guess, in that process. Maybe that's a bit arbitrary how I describe that, but it seems
Actually,
to have that.
in the mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, they distinguish between the problem-solving mode of mind and the being mode of mind.
Mm-hmm.
And they say the problem-solving mode of mind is good for the external world. Like, oh, the example they'll give is like, oh, I look at the door and the paint is kind of chipping off. It needs to be repainted. Okay, so I know what to do. I go to the store, I get the paint, I come back and I do it. Versus, oh, I'm trying to make a decision. Do I want to go to college or not go to college? And then, how does that relate with my relationship?
Mm-hmm.
So that's like an internal thing that you can't use the same. You can't use the problem-solving mode of mind. It's not something where like, oh, I just need to do this, this, and this, and then
New lick of paint, that's it, job done.
Right.
And going to college.
They say the being mode of mind is like, oh, you have to be with the sensations, you have to be with the emotions, you have to let go of the conceptual mind trying to figure it out something. And so it's that being mode of mind then that allows you to be with it and allow things to organically process. So it's like two different processes and two sets of rules, I guess you would say.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, so it's like you have to learn how to use the being mode of mind and how it's different from the problem-solving mode of mind. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. It's nice as well. It reminds me of the power of cognitive behavioral therapy. Like I started that a long time ago in terms of self-help, and then had some therapy around that and found it really useful in terms of not with the behavioral therapy. Often, like you mentioned, thoughts are framing a situation in one way, but usually if unexamined, it could be that we're just trying to avoid a certain emotion or move towards a certain emotion that's not actually authentic, whereas ACT addresses that by saying connect to sensation, but also connect to your values, so you can sense that direction you're moving in is also kind of coherent and not not avoiding, not indulging, like you mentioned. I like that. Because I think as well, I had a conversation the other day about cognitive behavioral therapy, and I sometimes like forget the behavioral element. Just get stuck on like change your cognition, but the point is then you behave differently. If you're thinking differently, your emotional landscape changes as well. So it really is like, also with that, like acting upon that value, acting upon that more reasoned or logical interpretation, etc. Did we cover we covered the 6 components? Did you cover both sides as well, like the positive and negative? You happy with that? Okay, so we'll move on to the beginning of the synthesis. I know you touched upon a few different Buddhist principles, but more specifically, which principles and practices you've connected with this model?
Right. Yeah. So when I took this class and I learned about ACT, it kind of clicked. I'm like, oh, that I correlate this with this. I correlate this with this. And so it was it just kind of snapped in place. It like these different Buddhist teachings and practices that I learned. When I learned ACT, it kind of just crystallized or organized these things. And then over time, using it in counseling practice, and then also as I was working on my dissertation, kind of going deeper into what are these teachings and where do they come from? Over time, it just became more solidified or more robust what the correlations were. So for each of the ACT processes, then I have Buddhist teachings. Most of them are coming from the early Buddhist yogic teachings that comes from the Samyutta Nikaya and the Pali Canon. There's one exception with self as context. I use some Mahayana Yogacara teachings, but the other 5 processes I'm using early Buddhist yogic teachings. So, and then so there's teachings and there's also specific meditation practice that I also have related to it as well. So for contact with the present moment, I use the teaching on the 4 establishments of mindfulness. And so that's like a yogic contemplative structure that the Buddha taught. And you can find a similar structure in early Taoism and also early Hindu yoga. So contact with the present moment, the Buddha taught the 4 establishments as 4 places to focus your awareness. So the first one is kaya in Pali, which is the physical body. And so you can be in touch with that when you can think of your body as made of the 4 elements. And so you're getting in touch with body sensation as the 4 elements. So like earth element is hard to soft, fire element is hot to cold, air element is movement to stillness, and then the water element would be like the experience of fluidity in your body. And so that's kaya, the 4 elements, and then it also relates to body posture, like, you know, sitting, standing, walking, laying down. If you're doing practice, you know, what posture is your body in? Okay, then the next one is Vedana, which translates as body sensation. And so you're still aware of sensation, but now you're paying attention, is the sensation pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral? So still aware of sensation, but instead of focusing on it as 4 elements, now you're focusing on, is it pleasant, unpleasant, neutral? Okay, then you have chitta, which is the heart mind. And so that's awareness itself that tends to be radiating from the heart center. And then, so you're aware of awareness, and then you're aware, is there any movement within the awareness, such as, you know, you're involved in thinking, focusing on some external phenomena of some kind. Okay, and then Dhamma is the teaching. And in early Buddhism, it tends to mean the 12 links of dependent origination. And so that tends to be describing the process of rebirth. And so the idea is you're aware of your body, the body sensation, and the heart mind within the deeper context of the 12 links. And so then when the Buddha's talking about meditation practice, or when he's talking about you know, being aware of what's going on, again, it tends to mean so what I add to this then is I add a specific meditation practice that goes with this. So the first one that I learned when I was in college is the Zen meditation, where you are counting the breath while you focus on the belly. So you're sitting in your meditation posture. Then you're aware of the sensations in the belly. So you're aware of it as 4 elements and pleasant, unpleasant, neutral. And then you're counting the breath. And so the counting is giving you a steady thought to help you not be carried away by other thoughts. So the counting also involves your heart mind. And then so you're counting the breath in the belly. You're aware of your whole body, and you're aware of your heart mind as well as it relates to the counting. And so that practice, that's one of the practices I use then to help be in contact with the present moment. So just to summarize then, contact with the present moment, you have this yogic structure. You're using that to be in touch with the present moment. So then not being in touch with the present moment would be that you're not in touch with that contemplative structure. You're lost in thoughts, or you're not aware of your posture. You're not aware of your breathing. Yeah, you're not in touch with it.
Because I know in our previous conversation, we spoke about derealization and like dissociation as quite a common trauma symptom. And it seems like this addresses that, like to bring yourself using the body or the body being a vessel to contact with the present moment more immediately than the mind often. And it's a good pathway into that deeper presence.
Yeah, and it's when we talk about the other processes, this will kind of become more clear. But it's my sense is like there's two channels of experience. One channel is body sensation, and the other channel is cognitive activity or cognition. So if you're aware of your breathing in the body, that's like the sensation channel. And then if you're aware of awareness itself and thought, that's like the cognition channel. And so this contemplative structure is helping you be in touch with both channels. And so then that's what's bringing you into the present moment, basically. That your present moment experiences these two channels and you're being in touch with it.
Yeah, because that's something, I find frequently when I feel super present, I'm thinking, which goes against like what the assumption is, like that, this idea of being thoughtless or the mind being completely clear, which is beautiful. But for me, that's much less common. But there are times where actually exactly what you say, the presence is being present to the non-dual experience of all the sensory input and the thought and the sensation. And I just find a good example is if I'm on a run and I'm having that deep connection to my body and my environment, and yet I start having creative thoughts that feel embodied. They feel like they're embodying me in the present more than taking me away. It's strange because I used to judge that a lot as, I'm caught up in thinking, but it's much different from when I'm like neurotic and I'm thinking a lot and just feel that as a barrier to the present. So I think maybe I'm misjudging that, but I sense that, as you say, bringing in being present isn't not thinking, I think is what I'm pointing to. Like sometimes it's just being present to the entirety of it all. And with that distance, like you mentioned with the principles as well.
Yeah, it's kind of like you're in touch with like two origin points or two origin sources. So one origin source is the sensory experience, and then another origin source is the source where thoughts are emerging. So if you're staying there at the origin place, you can be aware of the thoughts arising without getting carried away by them. And so, a lot of times you'll have really good thoughts because you're just there.
Yeah.
You're aware of when they're arising, and you can be in touch with their quality, but at the same time, you're not losing touch with the sensory experience. And you can be aware of how are the thoughts resonating in my body. So it's like the thought is not just kind of in your head, it's more you're experiencing it as it resonates with your whole body and this kind of deeper intuitive awareness. So it's like, you can feel, this has substance and weight versus this is just kind of a thought without much substance and weight.
Yeah, and frequently, like in those kind of states, a lot of aliveness, or like even if it can feel like a commentary and interpretation, but there's a different quality. I like how you describe that, and it does feel like a lucidity to the thoughts that appear in a way that is different, and almost as if when like they're transcendent. They transcend the self. And that's something I found like the biggest shift internally that I've had is going from that being super neurotic to being more of a creative person. I still oscillate those two quite frequently, but when in a creative space, the quality transcends the self. So it's not so isolating, and it's almost as if thought, rather than existing in mind, and I know we're talking in this context of interconnection as well, it could be that there's a greater a greater mind, a greater source of thought that's connected to when you're present and in those states as well.
Yeah, and I've kind of started thinking about this recently, that we experience thought as words, and that tends to kind of be in our head because it's like we're hearing it as like as if it's spoken out loud. And so then there's this habit of identifying with the thoughts as like, okay, that's me, that's my conceptual mind. And so then there's this feeling of, oh, I'm the voice in my head, and I've identified with that, like that's who I am. And then I'm kind of observing the rest of my body from this, command center up in my brain or whatever. So that's different from, oh, you get in touch with your breathing down in the body and the belly. You kind of step back from the conceptual mind, so you drop down more into this intuitive awareness that's in the heart mind. And so then you are aware of thought, but you're not identified with it, and you're not like identified as like an ego self up in the head, basically. So it's kind of that being able to drop down into the body and have that deeper witnessing awareness that I think is what allows you to be in touch with thought without the kind of habit of then identifying with it and being with it up in the head. Yeah. So I think that's one of the key things about this contemplative structure, which you can find it in Taoism and you can also find it in Hindu yoga, is that it tends to be a ground up thing where you start with the sensation and then you work your way up to the awareness. And it tends to have this overall effect of getting you into your body and being more an embodied intuitive awareness. And so then the thoughts are still happening, but you're experiencing it in a very different way. And then, yes, you can tell the difference between when you're aware of a thought in the present moment and it's resonating with your present moment experience versus you're getting carried away by the thought and you've lost touch with the rest of your present moment experience.
Yeah. The flip side of, you just summed it up really nicely. Like how it's almost like certain thought, like I know I'm someone as a writer and I talk far too much as well. Like I'm very, very verbal. So I have that strong, part of my brain or just part of my consciousness that is very well practiced verbally, inwardly with thinking, like you mentioned, and also just outwardly. And I wonder as well in those moments, sometimes rather than that neurotic thought centered around the self or ego, sometimes the verbal experience is actually just an interpretation of something that is them kind of moving through that verbal concept or linguistic kind of translation, even if it's just like, wow, this is cool, or oh wow, I feel really relaxed right now. It's like maybe that's going from the body, maybe it's coming from, there's a deeper sense or a deeper knowing that is then translated verbally. I like that as a description in terms of the difference.
Yeah, it's like kind of like a thought just arising from this intuitive awareness as opposed to the thought being the result of a logical train of thoughts where you're actively thinking and you arrive at this thought because of that logical process. It's more like, oh, it's just something that arises, it's there. And it can be logical, but it's less involved with like using your willpower and I mean, of course, using logic and actively thinking a thought out has its own benefits to it. But but again, the danger can be that you think that is the thought world as opposed to the thought can arise from a deeper place.
Yeah. And that's going to always be more efficient as a process. Rationality and logic is going to be more efficient if you're conscious of it and you have distance from the process of thinking through rather than just being caught up and then trying to do it from that entanglement. You can actually enhance logic through these practices rather than neglect it or overlook it.
Yeah. Okay, shall we move
Yeah,
to another?
because I'm trying to keep the structure in my mind now and tangent, but yeah, so that was related to the
Contact with the
presence.
present moment.
Yeah,
Hmm.
yeah. So the second one, moving on.
Okay. Um, so again, there's not any set order, right? It's kind of, and they're all interconnected. So if we talked about this another time, I might use a different order, but
Mm-hmm.
um, I want to shift to committed action. So in Buddhism, the understanding of what action is, you have to look at the 12 links of dependent origination to understand what is, in the early Buddhist teaching, what is understood, what does action mean? Um, so the 12 links describes the mechanics of rebirth, basically. And inside of the 12 links, there's two behavior patterns, you could say. And one of those behavior patterns deals with action, and usually it means like physical or verbal action, but it could also mean mental action, but
Mm-hmm.
more it means physical or verbal. Um, and so then, so I'm going to just take a subsection of the 12 links to talk about that. Um, so you have the link of contact, which in Pali is pasa, and contact means there's contact between a sense base and a sense object. So you hear something with your ears, you see something with your eyes, you smell something with your nose, you taste something with your tongue, you touch something with your body. That could be an external touch or two parts of your body inside touching each other. Or you come into contact with a thought. So your mind consciousness connects with some kind of mental phenomena.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so that's contact. And then the contact gives rise to sensation, which is Vedana. And as I said before, the sensation could be pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. Okay, then the sensation gives rise to craving. So then I'll say it the way the Buddha says it, and then I'll give a more neutral way of saying it. But you have contact, then there's sensation, then there's craving, which is the intention to act based on the sensation.
Mm-hmm.
Then there's grasping, which is you act on it, you act on the craving. And then there's becoming, which is the embodied result of the grasping. So if I was to use more neutral terms to describe it, you would say, okay, there's still contact, then there's sensation, then there's intention slash emotion. And the Buddhist term for that would be sankhara. So you
Mm-hmm.
have Vedana, and then there's sankhara, which comes out of the Vedana. So that's intention slash emotion. Then there's action, which would in Pali is kama, Sanskrit is karma. So action here means there's an intention, emotion, and then you act on it. Okay, and then once you act on it, then there is becoming. The Pali word is bhava, so that's the result. So this is a behavior pattern. And so an example could be, I'm talking to you now, and then I feel my throat is dry. Um, so I'm in contact with dry sensations in my throat. It's a little bit unpleasant. So then I have the intention, oh, I want to get a drink of water. Okay, so if I actually go and get a drink of water, I drink the water. That would be the acting. And then there's the result. Oh, I drank the water. Now my thirst is quenched.
Mm-hmm.
So that's an example of the behavior pattern or the behavior chain, right? Another one could be I'm at work. Somebody says something mean to me. So I hear something. It causes unpleasant sensation in my body. That gives rise to anger and the desire to say something mean back to the person. Then if I act on it, I actually say it.
Mm-hmm.
And then now I experience the result of having said that.
Mm-hmm.
So that would be unwholesome becoming because the unwholesome intention, emotion of anger arose, and then I acted on it, and then I had the unwholesome result. you could have, okay, I'm at work, somebody says something mean to me. There's unpleasant sensation in my body. It gives rise to the desire to say something mean back to the person. But because I'm a Buddhist, I recognize, that's an unwholesome intention, emotion. If I act on it, it's not going to be good. So I go back to the sensation. I go back to my breathing. I'm aware of the sensation. I let go of the anger, and I'm just coming back to the sensation. I'm sitting with that for a little bit. And then another intention emotion comes up. This time it's a wholesome one of, oh, just let it go. Don't respond, or, oh, say something, but say something that's constructive, not something that's out of anger, right? So either I let go, I don't act on it. And so then I'm reborn as someone who didn't act on it, basically. Right?
Yeah.
Or I act on it, but it's a wholesome thing. So I'm reborn as someone who acted on it as a wholesome thing. So action then is seen as something that's part of this behavior chain. And the action is mainly caused by intention emotion that's arising from the body sensation. So it's you could say it's like sensory behavioral instead of cognitive behavioral. It's like there's body sensation, and that's really driving the behavior even more than the thoughts. The thoughts can give rise to sensation in my body. And so it's the sensation in the body that is giving rise to the emotion, which has an intention inside of it. And that's what's giving rise to the action or the behavior. So that's just saying, okay, that's how Buddhism would define action. And then, so one of the core teachings then would be the 5 precepts, which is kind of the foundational ethical code in Buddhism. So no killing, no stealing, no sexual misconduct, no false or harmful speech, and no addiction to intoxicants. So you could say that's kind of like your 5 guardrails of action. No matter what situation I'm in, if I'm in touch with something that's making me want to break a precept, then I have to be like, hey, wait a minute, there's probably some unwholesome intention emotion here. And if I act on it, maybe there'll be some short-term high, but it's going to lead to a crash. So I need to step back and be like, okay, I got to get in touch with my breathing and be aware of my body sensation so I can hold the emotion instead of being overwhelmed by it and acting out on it. So the 5 precepts are kind of the guardrails of how to avoid negative action. And then working with the intention emotion, working with the sensation, then the general idea is you're wanting to cultivate wholesome states of body and mind, and you want to act on wholesome states, and you want to let go of unwholesome states, or you want to metabolize them or transform them into wholesome states. And so that gets into meditation practice as well as the precepts itself. But instead of it being more meditation where you're just sitting, it's, you're in your daily life and you're involved in actions. And so you're assessing, is this action a good action or not? Should I do it or not? So you're paying attention basically to this behavior chain. And you're using that to help you. The idea is you want to steer the process of rebirth in a wholesome direction, and you want to steer it away from an unwholesome direction.
Yeah, which it really talks to the power as well, like the transformative power of mindfulness or being aware and not being responsible rather than reactive, which is crucial. How, in terms of the dynamic of wholesome and unwholesome and metabolizing to more towards wholesomeness, how would you relate that to validating difficult emotions? Like, say I'm in a situation, like the example you gave, someone says something that's hurtful and anger arises. I know one of my tendencies for sure is wanting that to be validated in a dynamic. Like, no, do you not understand why I'm angry? Like this, I have reason to feel angry. And obviously there are times where I respond unwholesomely and maybe say, you know, I'm passive aggressive, or I say something hurtful. Times where I can be with the anger and respond in a more mature or caring way. But how would you relate that metabolization with? I use the term validation. I guess it's acceptance, really, isn't it? If you're validating something, you're accepting that it's got a value there. But yeah, interested to know you.
Yeah, so again, this gets into how the processes interrelate. So when you're talking about action and you're trying to evaluate something, then you're engaging in the practice of acceptance as it relates to that action. So they interrelate.
Yeah.
So when we talk about acceptance, we'll say more about it. But so yeah, so you're looking at this chain of behavior, and so when something comes up, then you want to be aware of, okay, how is this fitting in the chain? So, you know, what was the contact that brought it up? What are the sensations that are in the body? What's the emotion? So, yeah, when the emotion comes up, you want to be able to recognize the emotion. You don't want to suppress it, but you also don't want to act on it until you're confident. Oh, yeah, this is something good to act on versus this is not something good to act on. And so an emotion, the Pali word would be sankhara, and that has a lot of different meanings in Buddhism. But in the context of this behavior chain, it tends to mean intention/emotion. And so a sankhara is made up of body sensation and then a story. So if you have anger, you recognize, okay, anger is arising. Okay, so how do I feel it in my body as body sensation? And then what is the story that's going with it, right? So that tends to mean like a thought pattern of some kind, or, you know, a cognitive stance of some kind. So first it's just recognizing, okay, it's the emotion is there and I'm recognizing it. So you can say to yourself, oh, I'm angry. Anger's happening right now. If you're with another person, depending on the situation, you could say, oh, I'm having anger right now. So you're just recognizing, oh, anger is happening, but it's not like you're acting on it in a way that would be negative. It's more just like, oh, you're recognizing the anger is there. Depends on some people, they can ride with that. Some people might freak out about it. So it's better not to say.
Yeah. So I'm angry. Oh my God, what have I done?
Okay, so then the trick is how to be with the anger without adding another layer of complexity on top of it. Like, oh, I shouldn't feel the anger, or I'm bad because I'm feeling it. Or, oh, I'm right to feel the anger. I should feel the anger. And
yeah.
How to just be with it as, okay, this is anger. And then what Buddhism tends to say is, oh, be with it as sensation more than the story. Be in touch with the story enough to know what the story is, but then focus your attention more on the sensation, because that tends to be more stable and it helps you be more in touch with what's happening, while at the same time having more space around it so that you're not pushed to act on it, but you're also not repressing it. You can just be with it. Okay, and so then you're being with the anger, and then, yes, I think you can distinguish between healthy anger versus unhealthy anger, right? Healthy anger is the amount of anger you have is it fits with the situation. It's not like an over amount of anger, like making a mountain out of a molehill. It's like, okay, yeah, it fits with what's happening. And then you want to be, is there any judgment inside of it? Like, am I saying, oh, this person is an evil person, or, some kind of judgment layer? If there's a judgment layer, that's usually not going to help. It's usually unproductive. And it's like, oh, I'm superior, they're inferior,
Mm-hmm.
Or if you're angry at yourself, then you're like, you're judging yourself. If there's that judgment thing in there, that usually means it's not going to be helpful.
Mm-hmm.
So you got to keep sitting with it. And then if you get to, oh, I need to express a boundary, like when so-and-so did this, it made me feel suffering. I didn't like it. I don't want them to do that.
Mm-hmm.
That's like a clear boundary thing where you're helping the other person not cause suffering, and you're helping yourself not experience suffering from the person. So then that's a clear expression of anger that's more, in a sense, a way, it's like a version of compassion that
Mm-hmm.
it's like setting a boundary. But sometimes the anger is just, oh, I'm angry and I don't, it's, if I express it, it's not going to help. And so I just got to let it go. I got to
Mm-hmm.
like let it go back down without acting on it. And so then it's like, whatever strategy you need to do that. And then, so sometimes you kind of have to use your rational mind to just explain to yourself or the other person what it is you need to explain, just as a way to negotiate the situation. Because it's like, yeah, the anger that you have is not worth acting on. It's not worth expressing. You may not have fully, it may still be there, but you don't want to, it's not going to be helpful. So sometimes some rational explanation is involved just to negotiate the situation.
Yeah. And the wisdom as well of knowing that in terms of that kind of chain of behavior, of knowing when strong emotions are present, you're likely not as rational, or you might say something that you gave the good example of allowing things to cool and then a better solution comes up. So even if you kind of buy yourself a bit of time, or it's like how thought and behavior adapts to strong emotion. Like when anger is present, the rationality reduces, it becomes a lot more argumentative potentially, or filtered through judgment. I like that as a way of describing that that approach to difficult emotions and stuff like that.
And so so a lot of it's like just going back to previous links in the chain. So you want to get back to the sensation itself, and then be aware, okay, is it an unpleasant sensation? If it's unpleasant, is there aversion towards it, right? I'm trying to get rid of it. And if I let go of the aversion and I just come back to the unpleasant sensation, then out of that can come a more authentic response as opposed to a reaction. Yeah. So that tends to be something that feels more centered, more grounded. So this idea of this behavior chain and these links, you're trying to be in touch with what's my intention, and you want to be in touch with it as sensation in the body. Because a lot of time you can have an intention that sounds good in your head, but when you actually act on it, it doesn't work out good, So a lot of time it's really like, oh, how do I feel it in my body as sensation in the body? And that's a more true indicator of what is my actual intention. What's going to be the result if I act on it? And so it's through practice, trial and error that you figure out, oh yeah, this feels good in my body, and when I act on it, it turns out good. Or, oh, this feels like there's still some reaction happening here. Usually when I act on this, it turns out not good.
Yeah. The example that comes to mind for me, just to be honest about my own mechanisms, is making a joke about the situation when I can actually still feel some tension. So I know there's a bit of sting to that joke. Yeah. And then that I like the whole "it's just a joke" thing is awful, and I hate to contribute to that in my own way at times. But I feel that, and I'm actually even though I was making light of the situation, you were saying that, and I was relating it to the times when I joke from a feeling of lightness, and the times where I joke where I'm actually, there is still a bit of sting. I want it to land a certain way, and the trial and error of knowing when not to do that, because it never goes well.
Yeah, and then the person gets pissed, and then you're like, "Oh, why are you pissed? It was just a joke, you know?"
Exactly. And then it just fuels the
yeah,
which is actually really manipulative. There you go. These are my mechanisms.
Right. But that would make a great like stand-up routine of someone talking about that.
Yeah. Well, I think it's quite common. Like, I'm sure most people have probably been on the receiving end of that, and it is a difficult behavior to respond to, and I wonder if it is linked to the intuition of feeling where that person's coming from. So knowing like, okay, this idea of it being a joke is actually like a conceptual excuse from a barbed insult or whatever, and not to like go too far down the deconstruction and stuff like that, but it does
that's
give
like the two channels, like the sensation channel and then the cognitive channel. And the cognitive can try to overlay the sensation channel and think it knows what it's doing.
Yeah, that's true. Oh no, I'm fine. I'm completely calm. I'm just joking, actually. Yeah. Where are we at in the model? I'm conscious of the time. I know we've still got a few.
Sure.
A few steps.
Okay, so that committed action, the 5 precepts are like the guardrails, and then you're in touch with this behavior chain that's inside the links of dependent origination, and then the general idea is you're trying to steer the process in a wholesome direction and steer it away from an unwholesome direction. So then if you get into the Eightfold Path, that kind of gets deeper into being aware of the process and steering it in the right direction, and cultivating wholesome states and abandoning unwholesome states. So anyway, so that's kind of the gist of the committed action. Okay, so then if we get into acceptance and cognitive diffusion, you're still working with the links of dependent origination, but now it's focusing more on the internal experience, like that you would experience in meditation versus like out in the world acting. And so then, I just want to say what for the committed action, one practice that goes with the committed action would be the recitation of the 5 precepts. So that would be a regular practice you do in Buddhism, that you recite the 5 precepts and you kind of check yourself in terms of how am I doing with that. So that's an actual practice. And then the Eightfold Path, of course, is also a practice. But I won't spend a lot of time there, because when I get into acceptance and diffusion, that kind of gets into some of the Eightfold Path. But I just want to clarify that each process, I have a practice that goes with it.
Yeah.
Okay, so for the practice of acceptance, the practice that I put into that is the body scan meditation. And mainly I learned this from the Goenka Vipassana lineage, which is a Burmese Vipassana lineage, and they specialize in the body scan practice. So when I talk about acceptance, I mainly mean I'm working with body sensation and emotion. And then when I talk about cognitive diffusion, then I'm mainly talking about working with thoughts. So acceptance for me is mainly, sensation and emotion, and then using a body scan practice to work with the sensation and emotion. So again, when we look at the links, you have contact, and then there's sensation, and then there's emotion that comes up from the sensation. So in the Goenka body scan practice, the first thing they have you do is awareness of breathing at the nose. And so you're aware of sensation at the nose and the upper lip. And the idea is that's giving you a neutral to pleasant sensation to focus on as a way to help you have a stable awareness and help you kind of calm the body and mind down. So you want to start with neutral to pleasant sensations to help stabilize the body and mind. Okay, so if you do like a 10-day Goenka retreat, the first 3 days, awareness of breathing up the nose. Okay, then the remaining 7 days, you're mainly doing a body scan practice. You're just systematically moving your awareness through the body. If you get to a place where you're feeling kind of overwhelmed, you can go back to the breathing at the nose to calm it down or relax it. Okay, so then you're in the body scan practice. And so they teach two elements of it, you could say. One is, again, you're aware of the body sensation as the 4 elements. And they even talk about your body is made of kalapas, which are like tiny little particles. And each particle has inside of it the 4 elements. And so you're paying attention to your sensations as the 4 elements. And this goes all the way back to Lady Sayadaw, who initiated the lineage. And then you're aware of sensation as pleasant, unpleasant, neutral. And that tends to be what Ubakin and Goenka seem to have added in. So those are 2 teachers in the lineage. So you're moving your awareness through the body. You're aware of the sensations, and then you're just being aware, is it pleasant, unpleasant, neutral, and how do I experience it as the 4 elements? Okay. Then as you're doing the body scan, you're paying attention. When you have a pleasant sensation, does any craving come up from it? Like, are you trying to grab onto something? If you have unpleasant sensation, is there any aversion towards it? Are you trying to push it away? If you have neutral sensation, do you space out? You're not aware of it. So you're always focusing on the sensation, and then are any of these what they would say sankharas? Are any sankharas coming up from the sensation? So the sensation is the Vedana, and then the sankhara would be the reactions that could come up. So the reactions tend to be emotions, right? So if you have unpleasant sensation, you could have fear, you could have sadness, you could have anger coming up. If there's pleasant sensation, you could have craving coming up, trying to grab onto it. So the practice is, if you notice a reaction come up, you recognize the reaction. And so again, the sankhara is made up of sensation and a story. So you're recognizing, okay, there's this sensation and story that's there. And then you shift the attention away from the story back to just the sensation itself. So that's the practice, is aware of sensation, and a reaction comes up, you're aware of the reaction, and then you shift your focus of attention back to the sensation. And so then the idea is you're doing this systematic scan. So you will be moving through different sensations, neutral, pleasant, unpleasant. And the idea is you don't want to stay in any place too long. You just want to keep moving through. And so then as a result, what tends to happen then is you're just letting go of, or you're releasing these reactions. And then you're staying with the sensations, you're letting go of the reactions. Okay, so my research then, I've compared the Goenka Vipassana with the somatic experiencing from Peter Levine. And they have a very similar theory and practice that they talk about trauma as you're caught in a cycle where you have overwhelming sensation, and then that leads to overwhelming emotion, and you're carried away by the emotion, and then that results in a reenactment of the trauma, or like a flashback of the trauma. And so they say the key to getting out of that is distinguishing between the sensation and the emotion, focusing the attention back to the sensation, and then working strategically with the sensation so as to let go of the emotion and metabolize the habit energy. And then so they have strategies of resourcing, which is focusing on neutral to pleasant sensation first to build up the wholesome sensation. And in counseling, that can also include the attunement between the therapist and the client as part of what's helping you build the pleasant to neutral sensations. And then once you've got that as your foundation, then when you get activated, then you're aware, okay, there's unpleasant sensation. And then they do what's called pendulation, where you're alternating between the pleasant and the unpleasant. So you go back and forth between the two. And then there's titration, which is you just take in the unpleasant sensation in small doses. So you're aware of it for a little bit, and then you move away from it back to the sensation. And then what will happen then is that tends to unwind the activated material, the habit pattern, which tends to be some unmetabolized experience from the past. It's been activated. And so now then you're using this practice to help you metabolize it, basically. And so Goenka Vipassana, they would say the same thing, that you're basically releasing these sankharas that are stored up in your system from your past experience. So you're working with the sensation and the emotion, you're working with it to accept what's happening and to release or let go of stored up material. So that's kind of a deep dive then into the Goenka Vipassana as a technique, and then how it correlates with the somatic experiencing. So in kind of a less intense way, you could just say, when you're doing the practice of acceptance, you're wanting to be in touch with your body sensations and your emotions. And if you have sensations or emotions that feel overwhelming, then you want to use particular strategies to help you be with it, so that you can contain it in such a way that it's not overwhelming. You can be with it and accept it. And so then that usually allows you, then you can accept your experience as opposed to trying to push it away. And then if there's some kind of habit energy in your experience, you can metabolize it. So that would be then, acceptance.
I've completely lost track of where we're at, so I trust you to
Oh, yeah, sure.
to know where we're going next.
Okay. But anyway, the general idea is experiential avoidance would mean you don't want to be with the sensations and emotions. So you might go up into your head, or you try to suppress it, or you try to cover it up, like you want to act out like, oh, I'm experiencing pain, I don't want to be with this, so I'm going to go have a few drinks, right? Or the other side would be, oh, I'm experiencing the pain, it's hard for me to be with, I need to lash out, you know? So experiential avoidance would be that, right? Trying to avoid it or acting out on it in a negative way. Acceptance would be that you're able to be with it and metabolize it. Yeah. Okay, so then another process then is the cognitive diffusion. And so then inside of the 12 links, there's another behavior chain, which I'll just kind of summarize it is, you have awareness itself, and then there's movement within the awareness, and then that can result in getting carried away by thoughts, or having your attention get distracted out onto something. So the most common way would be like, oh, you're in meditation, you're counting the breath, and then you get carried away by your thoughts, so you lose your count, you lose the breath, right? So that would be cognitive fusion, means you got carried away by the thoughts. Cognitive diffusion would be, you're sitting in meditation, you're aware of a thought arising, and instead of getting carried away by it, you're able to let it just be there in your awareness, but you're still in touch with your breathing and your body, and you're not caught in the thought. So it's the difference between being aware of a thought versus thinking a thought, basically. So in the early Buddhist meditation practice, they'll talk about aware of the heart mind, which is the citta. And then they talk about liberating the heart mind, which would mean if you're identifying or attaching to something, you become aware of that as a behavior pattern. So we're still talking about behavior, but now it's at a subtle level where there's just awareness itself, and out of that awareness, a volition arises, and it gets caught up in some kind of phenomena. So the practice is to be aware of awareness itself, and then if there's some movement, instead of getting caught up in it, you're letting go of it and dropping back into just the awareness itself. And so one of the practices you can do for that is a mantra practice where you're reciting a mantra coordinated with the breath. And so by picking one thought to repeat, you're staying close to the source of the thoughts. And so then you can tell the difference between that thought and another thought. And so then that's helping you stay at the source of thought and not get carried away by other thoughts. Yeah.
I also like that. The really subtle like metaphysics of like when you mention movement, I can relate that to meditation, and like you can feel it, right? Like there's a feeling to that movement that is really hard to describe to someone who doesn't meditate or hasn't kind of meditated on that process. And yeah, it's almost like there is that experiential. It's not just conceptual to say aversion or grasping. Like you can feel that. A good example, actually, it's something I notice a lot. Might be if I'm in a situation and I have an impulse to check my phone, and I can feel it's like I can feel the movement of okay, my consciousness knows where my phone is, and then it can go like zoom, and there is that really subtle movement of energy on that level, that when you do start to realize that the embodiment of non-attachment becomes like a metaphysical practice rather than just an idea or a concept. And I think that's such a breakthrough in terms of a practice. You start to it's almost like, because I notice it with human behavior as well. We talk about a lot about resonance or dissonance or being drawn towards someone or repelled. And I've noticed that as well. Like if I'm in certain dynamics where I can feel like I'm actually being pulled away from my center, and it's really subtle, and I'm like, oh, I've got to just like go back towards myself, because I have that tendency to kind of disconnect from myself or lose myself. So yeah, that's really powerful as a practice, I find, to experience what that subtle movement is like on that level of consciousness.
Yeah, and again, this like the secret sauce of ACT is it's got the subtle level of awareness, which correlates in Buddhism with, you start more at the gross level of sensation and emotion that drives physical behavior. And then by working with that, then you get to the more subtle level of just awareness itself, and then movement arising within the awareness. So you have to have a subtle level of awareness to be aware of that as like a behavior pattern that's happening. And so then instead of thinking the ego is a reified thing, it's more, it's a process or a behavior pattern. And yeah, so I think it's just having that kind of deeper ground of witnessing awareness that enables you to be aware of this as a pattern of behavior. And so then when you become aware of the pattern, then that gives you more freedom of, do I want to engage with it, or do I want to let go back into the kind of ground out of which the behaviors are rising?
Yeah. And noticing those, like you say, those patterns of behavior, that's really, there's a huge breakthrough there when you notice a common one, I'm sure I'm not alone in this, is like if you have an experience of shame, there can be just a strong impulse to hide or to avoid. And as well, like I know when I would first start practicing mindfulness, I would notice that if I felt anxious, I almost instantly wanting to rush through situations, talking quicker, moving quicker, trying to get through, and starting to practice like, okay, I'll slow down my breathing, I'll talk slower, I'll try not to rush, and that actually helps the anxiety. But just these at the source, that really subtle aversion to the anxiety and like, oh, I don't like this, I'll move through it, leads to actually quite macro behavior. Where are we at on the model?
Yeah, we still have self as context and values.
Self as context and values. We started touching upon self as context with this idea of the witnessing and like the non-dual. Maybe we can continue with that. If there's
exactly.
more to explore.
That's what I was thinking as well.
Perfect.
So there is kind of a organic relation between cognitive diffusion and self as concept. So cognitive fusion is when you're buying into a thought versus just being aware of the thought, right? Okay, so self as concept is that you're buying into a concept of self versus being aware of it as a concept, but not buying into it.
Mm-hmm.
So it's the same process of cognitive diffusion, but in this case, the thought is the thought about self as opposed to a thought about something else.
Mm-hmm.
So the thought about self has its own kind of unique quality to it that kind of differentiates it from other thoughts. So that kind of is one reason why it's in a separate category. And then also, like we're saying, when you're doing the cognitive diffusion practice, it tends to lead to getting in touch with a witnessing self or a witnessing awareness. And so then that's another reason why it's given its own process, because ACT wants to further unpack what that is actually.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
With before we move on with that, like the buying into process.
Yeah.
Like we were talking about that distancing.
Mm-hmm.
It's essentially you don't even realize that you've identified, right? Like it's so embedded in your experience that the thought just, you're not questioning it, you might not even be aware of it, and you're responding to it as if it's true. So you've like deceived yourself. Be it a judgment, an interpretation, or like you say, an actual belief about yourself, how people respond to you, whatever scenario that may be. It's so buying into it means that you're not necessarily even aware that this is thought, that you've just merged with it so much that you become it, and and that's just reality.
Taken as fact.
It's taken as fact. Yeah.
So I think that's one thing, like in meditation, like counting the breath, focusing on the belly. You can go through a clear progression in which there's a feeling of like, oh, I'm carried away by my thoughts. And then you get to where you drop down more, your awareness drops down more into your body. And then there's an experience of, oh, thoughts are happening, but I'm not carried away by them.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's kind of like the thoughts are kind of sticky and you get caught into the thoughts. So it's like a stickiness.
Mm-hmm.
But when you drop into this deeper embodied awareness, then it's like the stickiness starts going away. So then it's just, oh, a thought's happening, but there's not the stickiness of me identifying into it.
Yeah.
So then you start feeling you're down in your body, and then there's kind of more just this open space that you experience. Your awareness is more this open space that feels relaxed and happy. And so then you become aware, oh, before I was in my thoughts and I was in kind of a closed space, and it's kind of the stickiness of getting in the thoughts, versus, oh, now I'm in this kind of open witnessing space. There's like open awareness. And so it's like the awareness itself becomes more refined and more subtle, so that there's not the automatic stickiness getting caught into the thoughts.
Mm-hmm.
So that experience of cognitive fusion, it has a qualitative experience of the awareness being not as refined and getting stuck into it. Yeah.
Yeah.
This is when you get to this kind of witnessing awareness, then you feel, oh, this feels different. The awareness itself feels different. And so then the thoughts themselves, they just kind of come and go, but they're not sticky.
Yeah. So there's a good, it might have been Andy Puddicombe from Headspace, but there was a metaphor of a feather on glass. When like thoughts become like feather on glass, that's when you know you're in a open space. Like it they can become incredibly light, feather light, and float through consciousness rather than, like you mentioned, the stickiness. I also just find it fascinating that there are these ontological qualities to thought. It's like, because it's not just that it's not like, at least in my experience of it, it's not like just like you're using that as a metaphor. Like there's that dimension to the conscious experience of that stickiness, whatever that is. Yeah. Anyway, that's another another tangent, but that's fascinating.
I mean, we don't have time today to go into it, but I correlate the Buddhist contemplative structure with the Taoist one, and so there's kind of like, focusing on the breath energy in the belly, focusing on the heart mind as a source of awareness. It kind of gives you a different anatomy to relate to your experience.
Mm-hmm.
And then, the experience of breath energy and how it relates to awareness. So then, becoming sensitive to kind of this range of subtle to dense experience within awareness itself.
Mm-hmm.
So it's kind of a combination of all these things that, it literally, like you're saying, feather on glass. Yes, that's exactly what it is. It's like almost like the tactile quality of awareness.
Yes. Yeah, exactly.
As like a tactile phenomenon.
Yeah, it actually has that tactile quality. I'll ask it. I hope I don't send us away from, because I know you're in a trail of thought, but I've experienced, because you mentioned that stickiness, I've experienced that with my sense of self through experiences of ungroundedness, paranoia, like when my mental health has been really poor, a feeling that through the waking experience, like just out in the world, that I was getting stuck energetically, and that's something I've had to work on. And it's in recent years, because of that ontological understanding of that tactile element of energy, I've only then really been able to address it, because I've had to just admit that it is a thing, to work on it. And that's been a huge practice for me. Like, rather than that stickiness that can manifest as like paranoia or just self-consciousness, being like the feather on glass as I move through the world. So I wonder if there's a link there as well, in terms of at one point that sense of self that I had was very just had that stickiness to it that was attracting, or I was getting stuck in experience, and just thought I'd add that on because it's relevant to that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think like early Buddhism, early Taoism, these were oral traditions before reading and writing. And I think it really is kind of getting you to this more embodied, intuitive awareness, which would be more sensitive to touch, and would be aware of concepts, but aware of concepts in relation to the sensory experience. Whereas when you get into the reading and writing, then the conceptual mind can take over so much that you're not aware of how much you're in the conceptual mind, and then you kind of lose touch with the possibility that there even can be a range of experience.
Yeah.
So then it just kind of gets baked in.
Yeah. Lost in the realm of concept and disconnected from. from those two channels again, it kind of brings back to those two channels of the sensation and the cognition side of it.
Mm-hmm. And then in the Taoist model, it'll talk about the Jing energy, the Qi energy, the Shen energy. And so again, it gives you an anatomy to be with your experience in such a way that it decenters the cognitive awareness. And it gives you focal points of awareness where you can rest in those places. So it makes it easier then to, be in that place as opposed to being up in the head.
So with this part and this comparison, like with ACT and the witnessing consciousness, you also mentioned that space beyond, like the non-dual.
Yeah.
How do you differentiate between the two? This is also maybe we have to have another conversation because there are things I want to ask related to my experience, but that idea of like the collapse of the witness is something more recently I've explored. But how would you differentiate that? Because it sounds on some level like to witness your thought, that's not the final destination, but the only place you can go, but that place beyond is something else.
Right. Okay, so then with self as context, this is where I bring in some Mahayana teaching. I use the Yogacara teaching on the 8 consciousnesses, which maps out consciousness, phenomenologically maps it out. And then I also have 2 practices. One is just resting in awareness, and another one is exploring what's the source of awareness. So, okay, the 8 consciousnesses, you have the 5 senses, seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, touching. Then you have the 6th one, which is the mind consciousness. So that's like thinking, right? So your eye will get in touch with the visual form. Your mind will get in touch with the mental phenomena. Okay, so those are 6. Then there's the 7th consciousness, which is the sense of being a separate self, the sense of being an individual self. And then the 8th consciousness is the store consciousness, or sometimes called the ground consciousness. And so it's the ground out of which the other 7 manifest. So the sensory experience, the mind consciousness, and even the sense of a separate self, these are seen as all manifesting out of the store consciousness or ground consciousness. So with meditation practice, usually what they'll say is you need at first you need some object to be aware of, because your mind is so getting carried away. You need something just stable to focus on, right? So aware of the breathing, or aware of a mantra, or aware of a candle flame. You have an object to focus on, so that makes it easier to notice if your mind wandered off or not. So there's a certain school of Tibetan Buddhism, they'll say that's stopping with a support. You're trying to stop the mind from wandering off. And so you have a support to help you do that. So awareness of the breathing. So you have a subject of awareness and an object of awareness. So the object could be the breath. And then you have a subject that's aware of that object, right? Okay, so when you practice doing that enough, you get to where you can stay with the object and your mind is not wandering off. So that tends to help. You're more aware of the object, but then you're also more aware of the subject that is aware of the object, right? So that subject that's aware of the object is more the witnessing self, or the witnessing awareness. And so again, by being mindful of the breath or mindful of the body, you are also getting in touch with the witnessing self. So you can start to just experience more clearly, more directly, oh yeah, there is this witnessing self that's witnessing the sensations, witnessing the emotions, witnessing the thoughts. So you're still subject-object, but it's kind of like a clear witnessing subject that's not carried away by the objects. Okay, then over time, there can be the experience of awareness itself can become stronger and stronger. And so then it's like you start being aware, oh, even the subject of awareness is something that's manifesting in the awareness. And so then you kind of start opening up to just the awareness itself.
Mm-hmm.
And then the subject and object becomes less solid, I guess you would say. And so you're so the practice would be like awareness of awareness. You're aware of awareness. You're aware of your mind starting to move. You let go of that and you come back. You're just in the awareness itself.
Mm-hmm.
Or you're practicing what's the source of the awareness. So you're focusing on awareness. And then if there's any movement or deviation out of it, you turn yourself back into the awareness. So then it's kind of organic that the awareness itself becomes more vivid or more real. And then it becomes clear there's a difference between something that's an object of your awareness. It arises in your awareness and then it passes away, right? And then even, you have the experience of the subject of awareness and it has a certain quality to it that you can be aware of
Mm-hmm.
as an object. Whereas the awareness itself, you can't be aware of it like as an object. And because you can't be aware of it as an object, there's also no subject arising to be aware of it as an object.
Mm-hmm.
So then it's hard to explain, but it's kind of like this non-dual ground just organically becomes more and more manifesting. And so it's beyond your willpower to control. And yeah, it's deeper than the sense of being an individual self. So in this Yogacara teaching, it would be like, instead of identifying with one little piece of your experience, it's like you're opening up to the whole experience and you're letting go of the subject-object duality inside of that experience.
Mm-hmm.
So they would say then that your grabbing onto the stored consciousness starts to relax. And then there's just this underlying ground or non-dual ground.
Mm-hmm.
You could think like a farmer cultivating a field. You're cultivating wholesome states of body and mind. You're letting go of unwholesome states. But over time, you start to become aware, me, the farmer, is actually a manifestation of the field.
Yeah.
And so then, so it's kind of just
cool.
a natural, it's just a natural organic thing that happens. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And it feels good. It feels peaceful. It feels relaxing. It feels like you want to do it more and more.
Mm-hmm. There's a lot I want to say on that, but I'm going to park it because just for the time. Mm-hmm. I'm going to have the discipline, but I love how you describe that. And that essentially is like a lot of modern non-duality teachings. That's what they're pointing to, for better or for worse. Often they're not as embedded in the kind of systems that you embed it in. So I think it can come with problems. But yeah, I really enjoyed how you described that and just that experience of, I'll park it mostly, but I think that in my sense, things can also spring from the witness consciousness, like this meta level of thought of, oh, look how good I'm meditating, or I think can contribute to paranoia. That's something I want to explore more. Because I think that part of my awakening process was that cultivation of the witness and an expansion of awareness that then came with judgment, came with other things that created an outsourcing of thought. So that like the witness was like this projection of the judgmental God, like this idea of this kind of biblical judgmental God. But that's a huge topic. But it just, I really like how you articulated that.
Yeah, I think that's why it's important to have the yogic structure where you work with the sensations and then the gross level, and then you get to the more subtle level of sensation.
Yeah.
And that relates to the breath energy. And then that leads you to awareness of awareness. So it's kind of a ground up way of getting there.
Mm-hmm.
So that when you get to the non-dual place, it's not disembodied cerebral. It's like it's coming from a ground that you built up over time. So then it feels good, and there's kind of a trusting of it. Yeah.
Yeah, more of like the progressive path compared to the direct path of some schools. Are you good to move on to values? I'm conscious of the
Sure.
time. Yeah, did you cover the practice for that in terms of?
So I'm influenced by Ramana Maharishi, who's this Hindu teacher, and he taught self-inquiry, which is basically you're asking, who am I? And that means you turn the camera back on itself and you're trying to explore, where is the awareness coming from, the feeling of being or I amness, where is it coming from? And then also he would also teach surrender, meaning you're just letting go into the awareness. So those are two practices that could go with self as context. Yeah.
I love that we're touching upon this. Like self-inquiry, because it's really important, like this, that the way, again, just to reiterate that, because it's embedded in a much wider system. Without that, and a lot of modern teaching or interpretation of this just goes straight to that, what you've just said, without the rest of the supportive structure. And I think that it's kind of kryptonite at times, isn't it? That So yeah, although I know that Maharishi, he also did that, right? He also kind of pointed straight there. But I personally think the support structure is really important. Okay, so values. Moving on to values.
Okay, so I've correlated ACT values with the three jewels, the Four Noble Truths, and then the Mangala Sutta, the Discourse on Happiness. So the three jewels would be the Buddha, Dharma, Sangha, and the practice is taking refuge in the Buddha, Dharma, Sangha. So that means being aware of the Buddha, being aware of his teachings. So if you were alive during the time of the Buddha, it would mean spending time with the Buddha and taking refuge in his spiritual presence. And then it would also mean you listen to his teaching and you put it into practice. So that would be taking refuge in the Dharma. And then the Sangha would mean being with your fellow practitioners. And originally it meant other people that had reached spiritual awakening beside the Buddha. So you would be taking refuge in them as well. But over time, Sangha has come to mean the monastic Sangha in general. And then it's come to mean the Buddhist community in general, the lay practitioners and the monastics. So the value is that you value this process of spiritual awakening, and you want to be with teachers and teachings and practitioners that are supporting you to do this practice. So that would be like a core value then. Then the Four Noble Truths would be you're aware of the overall teaching about the 12 links and the four establishments of mindfulness and the Eightfold Path. And then I didn't say it, but the 16 exercises of mindfulness of breathing, that kind of is the nitty-gritty of the meditation. So we talked about that without me saying I was talking about it. So the Four Noble Truths, just, you're aware of the process of rebirth and you have the overall value. You want to steer it in a positive direction. You want to steer it away from a negative direction. Traditionally, there's three goals: greater welfare and happiness in the present life, favorable rebirth, and then liberation from rebirth. So that would be kind of the trajectory you're trying to go on. Okay, then in the Mangala Sutta, it's a discourse on happiness where the Buddha talks about different life areas that you should focus on. So he talks about family life, being skilled at a trade, having a job, living in a suitable environment, spending time with people that are a good influence on you, being charitable to people that are in need, not being addicted to substances, spending time with monks and nuns, keeping the precepts, and then, eventually over multiple lifetimes, at some point becoming a monk or nun yourself, over multiple lifetimes, eventually attaining nirvana. So this is kind of like the values for the community, the lay practitioners and the monastics. It kind of gives you the overall ecosystem that you're in. And then early Buddhism became part of the Mauryan civilization, which was led by Chandragupta in India. And out of that came the Purusharthas, which are the 4 life goals. And so that talks about Dharma, meaning your duty to your family, your community. Artha, which means being skilled at a trade, making a living. Kama, which means pleasure. So that's like sexual pleasure, rest and recreation, art, culture, doing whatever you do for fun. And then moksha would be the spiritual awakening or spiritual path. So I kind of combine everything I've just talked about. I kind of use those all as values that are the values that the tradition comes with.
Yeah.
And then I tend to combine that with the ACT discussion, where it says, okay, here's these life areas like family, education, job, etc. So I guess long story short, I take the traditional values of the 3 jewels, the 4 noble truths, the Mangala Sutta, and then the 4 Purusharthas as the overall kind of Buddhist yogic set of values. Yeah.
Yeah. It makes me think as well, because I know you mentioned when we looked at ACT and values as not being dogmatic. What I really like about that, and I found this as well when I started studying Buddhism as a lay Buddhist, reading kind of various books and research on my own around it. Those values like give guidance. If someone's having a spiritual awakening, or someone's like, oh, I feel that, again, going back to that feeling aspect of the value, I feel I want to cultivate more spirituality. Here are some ways you can do that. It's not dogmatic, but find people that have a shared interest in spirituality. So you can take refuge there, like find a community if that's necessary, read scripture. I like that it's not dogmatic, but at the same time, it offers a structure that allows people to add spiritual value. Because I think that it can be hard to know where to look. And I find that in Buddhism, there were certain things where I was like, oh, that's something I can integrate as a practice, even if it is compassion. And I can just understand the context in Buddhism of compassion and then seek to integrate that as part of my practice. So I like that synthesis between the two in terms of values, and giving people the chance to choose, like try on a value, see how you like it. Maybe you adapt it and find a different way, but it adds that spiritual dimension in a practical way, in a structured way.
Yeah, it's not based on belief. It's more based on practice and trial and error. It's kind of like, well, according to our experience, based on the tradition, the experiences people have been having in the tradition, this seems to be the thing that is important.
Yeah. Yeah.
You can take it or leave it. You can try it out. If it works, great. If it doesn't work, it's not like a heavy-handed kind of thou shalt. It's more like, well, based on our experience, this seems to be what's important. So you have to try it yourself. You have to practice with it yourself and see if it matches with your experience or not. And yeah, if there's something new that hasn't been there before, we should add it in. Or if there's something there that is turning out to be not good or negative, we should take it out. But based on our experience, here's the things that have held up and kind of so far they keep holding up.
Yeah, and that's a really important distinction. They're lived practice, like values as an experience and as an action, rather than just like a concept, not like a list of sins or anything like that, but a way to strive to be
Mm-hmm.
as best as you can, like something to aim towards as well, like to become more aligned to those spiritual values.
Yeah, and some people, like I've shown this model to some of my friends, and some are more Mahayana, and so they'll bring in like the four immeasurables, like loving kindness, compassion,
Mm-hmm.
sympathetic joy, equanimity, or they'll bring in the 10 paramitas of like generosity, renunciation, um, concentration, wisdom. There's like these kind of
Mm-hmm.
wholesome values,
Yeah.
basically. um, so that I haven't. Sometimes Buddhism can come across as, oh, just don't do the negative things.
Yeah.
Um, um, but yeah, there are positive things that you can focus on and cultivate as, oh, this is a positive thing and it should be cultivated.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and my experience is, yeah, even if the early stuff doesn't say as much what the positive thing is, it's pretty obvious or self-evident or pretty clear.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but yeah, like we're saying, in general, it's something for you to practice with and find out for yourself, as opposed to thou shalt do this and there's no negotiation with it. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. Um, I'm aware we're around time. Was there anything that you wanted to add in terms of bringing it together and tying it together? Was there a way that you'd like to do that?
Yeah. Well, one thing, yeah, I liked hearing how, I think I mentioned this before in our last episode, that how Stephen Hayes is talking about ACT as acceptance commitment training.
Mm-hmm.
So he's kind of broadening it from acceptance commitment therapy to acceptance commitment training. So it can include therapy, but it can also be a training that you do outside of therapy as well. So I think with Buddhism, Buddhism comes as a training that you do as an individual, but something you also do as a community or a congregation. And maybe what informally, there's always been counseling happening in Buddhism.
Mm-hmm.
But now I feel like ACT can help us take the Buddhist theory and practice and more consciously develop the social context of counseling, whether it's one-on-one or group counseling. So I feel like ACT is helping kind of flesh out how Buddhism could be used in the context of counseling, and how these theory and practices that are already there, and that you find it in the meditation practice, how that could also be done as a relational practice or a counseling practice. So I think that's something that is a real benefit of correlating ACT with Buddhism.
Mm-hmm.
And then another, just a story came to my mind as we were talking. There's this Japanese Zen monk named Hakuin, and he's a pre-modern monk. I can't remember exactly what century, but so the story is that he became a monk and he was doing the koan practice, like who am I or what's your face before you're born. And he was practicing really hard, doing a lot of meditation. And then at a certain point, he got sick, like his body started getting weak and he was having issues, right? So he was wandering around Japan and he eventually gets to a cave. And inside the cave, he meets a Taoist hermit. And the Taoist hermit says, oh, well, you've depleted all your chi, you've depleted your breath energy. You have to do the practice of counting the breath, focusing on the belly. Don't do the koan practice, just do counting the breath, focusing on the belly as a way to rebuild your breath energy, as a way to rest the conceptual mind.
Mm-hmm.
And so they talk about like the ocean of chi, like you're wanting to build up this breath energy container, right? And that so he did that practice, and that restored his health, and it helped him, become get out of his head and be down in his body, and um, restore his health. And then once he did that, then he went back to the koan practice, and then the koan practice worked much better because he started with that foundation of the breath and the breath energy first.
Mm-hmm.
So I think the idea then of reviving this yogic tradition of practice in early Buddhism, early Taoism, where you have this contemplative structure, and then you have a progression where you're working with the body, and then the breath energy, and then awareness itself. But also seeing how they're interconnected. Right from the beginning, you're working with all of them because they're interconnected, but there is a general recommended progression or kind of a ground up approach to how you work with it. So anyway, that story came to mind as we were talking.
Yeah.
I guess the need for humans in general to reconnect to a yogic oral tradition that's before the reading and writing, and build up this yogic foundation. And based on that foundation, then you can get into the more kind of philosophical stuff, or the stuff where you're working with perception, but now it's a more grounded experience. So you can get into the high-end level of working with perception, but it's not deracinated or disconnected conceptual mind. It's like it's grounded.
Yeah. I'm fully with you on that. I really, and I just want to really acknowledge like how impressive this system is. I'm really awed by the expanse of your knowledge, and it's really quite evident that when you talk, it's because you embody this, and we've spoken, and I can see how you like kind of picking these different parts because it's alive in you, and I really appreciate that. And my sense, having talked through this, exactly what you say is that need to ground through a practice, and this kind of system allows for that clarity. I think it really allows that clarity, and not only the clarity of embodying and embodying that progression, but that link with ACT can allow it to become really tangible and workable for a lot of people as well. So yeah, I just want to acknowledge that and thank you for the work that you've put in, and will no doubt continue to put in. And I'm really excited to see how this evolves. And yeah, I'm sure we're going to have another discussion at some point soon.
Yeah, thanks for that feedback. I appreciate it. And yeah, it's kind of crazy. Like I kind of stumbled across ACT, and then I'm like, oh, this kind of fits with this kind of fits with that. And then the more I kept going, I'm like, yeah, it really does.
Yeah. Yeah.
But it's amazing how much it synchronizes with the early Buddhist teaching and the oral tradition, and the different elements that are there. It's amazing how there is this kind of organic fit. Yeah.
And clearly that is a gift that you have, that high level synthesis. I know that was I found you through that work that you did with the somatic experience in, and I just think it's super valuable to modernize these approaches, to be able to see those correlations and understand them well enough to know why they work and the kind of mechanics behind it, as well as the wisdom behind it. My voice has started going, so clearly we're out of time. But
that's your timer.
Yeah, John, it's been a pleasure, and I'm sure we will talk again. Did you have anywhere to point people if they're interested in more of this, more of your work?
Yeah, I have an online virtual temple. It's called Mukti Vihara. So that's MUKTIVIHARA.org. So there you can see meditation teachings, meditation practice, and then there's my podcast and my Substack are there. And then the other thing would be my academia page. If you look up John Brooks Freese or John B. Freese academia, and then you'll find the articles I've written that are published there also. Yep.
Awesome. Thank you very much, John. It's been a pleasure talking to you again, and I'm sure that people tuning in, they're going to get a lot of value from it, and hopefully they'll really enjoy the graphics that we add in post-production.
Cool. Yeah, thank you, Ricky. I've enjoyed it, and
Thank you.
I look forward to future conversations.
Me too. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Mind That Ego podcast. To stay up to date, you can join the Mind That Ego mailing list if you head to mindthatego.com/MFM. You'll also get a copy of my book, Mindsets for Mindfulness, when you join. You can also follow Mind That Ego on Facebook and YouTube, where the podcasts are also displayed in video format along with other inspired videos that I create. Or if Instagram is more your social media of choice, you can follow me at Ricky_Derisz. That's DERISZ.